retired Navy SEAL lived quietly at the edge of a snow-covered northern town, with only his German shepherd, Kepler, by his side. Then Emmett
You
Calder,
can't stay
the
hidden
owner of
up here
Calder
forever,
Hall,
Harlan.
and an old
They
friend of
know
Harlan's
exactly where
father,
you are.
invited him to the town's
Then
biggest
let 'em
auction
come.
as an unofficial security observer. During the auction, 3 masked men walked into Calder Hall, dressed in dark clothes and moving fast, but without shouting or panic. Harlan quietly stepped back with the guests, bending slightly and pulling Kepler close, pretending to be only an older man protecting his dog. But when the moment came, Kepler pulled at the tablecloth near the youngest thief's feet, throwing him off balance and turning his weapon away from the crowd. Then the room erupted into confusion as all 3 robbers were brought down one after another, collapsing to the floor as their plan fell apart and slipped completely beyond their control. Before we begin, please like and subscribe to help this channel reach 1,000 subscribers, and comment where you are watching from. Sawyer's Reach woke beneath a bright northern winter, the kind of morning that made even silence look clean. Snow lay over the rooftops in soft white folds. The pine trees stood tall beyond the town road, their branches heavy with frost, their shadows stretching blue across the packed snow like long, quiet prayers. Smoke lifted from chimneys in thin gray ribbons. Somewhere near the bakery, a delivery bell rang. Somewhere farther down the street, a child laughed as a sled scraped over ice. Sawyer's Reach was not a wealthy town, not by any measure that bankers would respect, but it had the rare warmth of a place where people remembered birthdays, borrowed tools, and knew the names of one another's dogs. At the far edge of town, where the last gravel road bent toward the dark line of the forest, Harlan Briggs lived in a small cedar cabin with a sloped roof, a creaking front gate, and boot prints that rarely led anywhere except to the woodshed, the mailbox, and back again. Harlan, at 58, stood about 6 feet tall, with the lean, compact strength of a man shaped by time, discipline, and weather, rather than by mirrors or gym walls. His shoulders were broad without being bulky, his movements economical, almost quiet enough to seem accidental. His face was clean-shaven, revealing a square jaw and high cheekbones that made him look sterner than he usually meant to be. His hair, brown threaded heavily with white, was cut short in a military style, just a little longer than regulation, as though some small part of him had allowed civilian life to loosen the old rules. The northern wind had browned his fair skin over the years, leaving him with the weathered look of a man who belonged to cold mornings and long roads. His eyes were gray-blue, steady and watchful, like winter water under thin ice. He wore the same kind of clothes most days, not because he lacked choices, but because choices had stopped mattering to him. An old olive-green tactical combat shirt, softened by years of washing, frayed lightly at the cuffs and shoulders. Moss-green combat pants with worn knees and cargo pockets that sagged from honest use. Scuffed military work boots darkened by snowmelt and road salt. On his left wrist, an old military watch with a scratched face kept time with the stubborn loyalty of a thing that had survived more than it was designed for. Beside him lived Kepler. Kepler was a 5-year-old male German shepherd, strong and sharply built, with a golden-black coat that seemed brushed by both sunlight and shadow. A black saddle spread over his back, while deep golden fur ran along his chest, legs, and neck. His muzzle was darker, his ears tall and alert, though one ear carried a small notch near the edge, a little mark from an old training accident that somehow made him look wiser than his years. His eyes were amber brown, intensely alive, always reading the world before the world knew it was being read. Kepler was not an old dog, but he had the stillness of one who had been asked to understand human danger too early. He could be gentle with children, patient with the elderly, and shamelessly dramatic when denied a second biscuit. But beneath that warmth lived something trained, something disciplined. He never wasted a movement. He never barked without cause. And when Harlan grew too silent, Kepler would place his head against the man's knee, as if reminding him that grief might be private, but it did not have to be lonely. Their mornings followed a sacred order. Harlan rose before sunrise, fed the stove, boiled black coffee, checked the back door, then filled Kepler's bowl. Kepler always waited until Harlan gave the smallest nod before eating. Afterward, the dog would sit by the window, watching the white road that led into town, while Harlan sat beside him with both hands wrapped around a mug that had lost its handle years ago. He did not go into town unless he had to. The people of Sawyer's Reach knew that. They respected it in the way small towns sometimes respect pain without naming it. They knew Harlan had once served in the military. A few knew he had been a Navy SEAL. Fewer still knew that he had spent part of his life walking into places where good people were trapped and bad men believed no one was coming. No one knew much about Jonah Pierce. Jonah had been 36 when he died, a broad-shouldered man with copper-brown hair, laughing eyes, and the unfortunate habit of telling jokes at the worst possible moments. He had served beside Harlan for years, close enough that silence between them had once been a language. Jonah had been the kind of man who could make fear seem briefly embarrassed of itself. Then one mission went wrong. One hallway, one decision, one door that should have opened sooner. Harlan came home. Jonah did not. Since then, Harlan had believed the safest thing he could do for the world was to stand back from it. That morning, however, Kepler refused his usual place by the window. The dog stood in front of the old storage chest near the hallway and stared at it. Harlan noticed because Kepler did not stare at empty things. Not like that. "What is it?" Harlan asked. Kepler did not bark. He stepped forward, lowered his nose to the chest, and gave one low sound from deep in his throat. Not a growl exactly. More like a warning remembered from another life. Harlan opened the chest. Inside were objects he rarely touched. Folded service papers, an old photograph of 3 men standing beside a transport aircraft, a cracked compass, a pair of gloves, and a small metal lighter that had belonged to his father, Thomas Briggs. Thomas had been a broad, plain-spoken man with silver hair, rough hands, and a laugh that filled rooms before he entered them. He had never worn a uniform, but he had lived by a kind of service just the same, fixing neighbors' roofs, pulling cars out of snowbanks, bringing firewood to widows before storms came. Kepler reached into the chest with his muzzle and nudged the lighter. Harlan's expression changed so slightly that anyone else would have missed it, but Kepler did not miss it. For a moment, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. The stove clicked, the wind moved along the eaves. Outside, sunlight flashed on snow so bright it looked almost holy. Then Kepler picked up the lighter gently in his mouth and carried it to the front door. Harlan stood very still. There were days when memory behaved like a photograph, flat and faded. Then there were days when it stood up, crossed the room, and placed itself at your feet. Before Harlan could speak, the sound of tires crunching over snow came from the drive. A dark green pickup rolled to a stop outside the gate. The man who climbed out moved carefully, as older men do when pride still believes in youth, but the knees have begun filing complaints. Emmett Calder was 74, lean and slightly bent at the shoulders, with a long face lined deeply by laughter, worry, and too many winters spent unlocking cold doors before dawn. His hair was white, combed neatly to one side. His eyes were pale blue, warm at first glance, but restless underneath. Emmett dressed like a man who believed every public appearance deserved respect. Wool coat, brown scarf, polished shoes not quite practical enough for snow, and a gray vest visible beneath the open coat. He carried a pie tin in one hand and a small envelope in the other. Kepler watched him through the glass. Harlan opened the door before Emmett knocked. "Well," Emmett said, forcing a smile too wide to be innocent, "if that dog of yours charges rent for staring, I already owe him money." Kepler gave one slow wag of his tail. Harlan did not smile, but his eyes softened by half a degree. For him, that was nearly applause. "Come in before you freeze," he said. Emmett entered with a gust of cold air and the smell of apple pie. He looked around the cabin as if seeing not just the room, but the years Harlan had spent making it smaller around himself. There were no medals on the wall, no flags framed under glass, no photographs displayed where guests could ask about them. Just wood, iron, books, a rifle cabinet kept locked, and a dog bed placed close enough to the stove to suggest that Kepler owned the warmest territory in the house. "I brought pie," Emmett said. "You brought trouble," Harlan replied. "That too," Emmett admitted, setting the tin on the table. But the pie came first, morally speaking. It was the kind of joke Harlan's father would have liked. That made it harder to ignore. Emmett sat only after Harlan gestured. He placed the envelope on the table but did not open it. His fingers lingered there, thin and spotted, the nails clean, the knuckles swollen by age. He looked like a man who had rehearsed this conversation several times and disliked every version. "Calder Hall has an auction tomorrow night," he began. "Biggest one this town has ever seen. I heard. Course you did. Sawyer's Reach can't keep a secret unless it's important." Harlan poured coffee into a second mug and set it before him. Emmett explained that the auction would include pieces from the Whitcomb estate. A captain's watch from the 19th century, a sapphire brooch, Civil War letters, a Great Lakes winter landscape, and the North Star Atlas, an old maritime map worth more than some houses in town. Collectors were coming from Minneapolis, Chicago, maybe even New York. There would be insurance people, private bidders, security staff, cameras, guest lists, the whole polished circus. I'm not asking you to guard it, Emmett said quickly, as if answering Harlan's refusal before it arrived. I hired professionals. Signed papers, paid too much, got the fancy badges and everything. Then why are you here? Emmett looked at Kepler. Kepler had settled beside Harlan's chair, but his eyes had not left the old man. Because 3 days ago, Emmett said, a stranger came asking about the rear entrance. Not the public entrance, not the loading schedule, the rear entrance. Yesterday, someone called the office and told me not to let the brown ledger see daylight. Harlan's face remained calm, but something in the room changed. What brown ledger? Emmett reached into his coat and removed a small photograph. It showed a worn leather book with cracked corners and a brass clasp. My father's ledger, land records, private notes, names, payments. Things people in this town buried before I was old enough to know what burial meant. He swallowed. It was never listed for auction. Nobody outside my family should know about it. Harlan looked at the photograph but did not touch it. No police? I told Dana Lockwood enough to make her frown, not enough to make her shut down the event. You know how it is. A vague threat, no name, no proof, a town full of people who already think I worry too much. Emmett tried to smile and failed, and maybe I do. Harlan leaned back. No, the word came quietly, but it had the weight of a locked door. Emmett nodded as if he had expected it. Your father would have said the same at first. Harlan's jaw tightened. Don't use him. I'm not using him. Emmett's voice softened. I'm remembering him. The stove popped. Kepler lifted his head. Emmett looked down at the lighter near the door, the one Kepler had carried there. Recognition moved across his face like a shadow of younger days. Tom Briggs pulled me out of a ditch in February of '89, Emmett said. I'd lost the business, lost my nerve, and was halfway drunk enough to freeze with dignity. He drove me home, put coffee in me, and said, a man doesn't have to save the whole world. He just shouldn't turn his back when someone knocks. Harlan said nothing. The sentence remained in the cabin like a coal that refused to go dark. Kepler rose slowly, took the lighter again, and placed it at Harlan's boot. Then he looked toward the road, not at Emmett, not at the pie, at the road into town. Harlan closed his eyes for a moment. He could feel the old life stirring. Not the violence, not the noise, but the responsibility. The terrible gravity of being able to see danger where others saw inconvenience. He hated that gift. He hated what it had cost. Yet beside him stood a dog who had never once asked him to be unbroken before being useful. Finally, Harlan opened his eyes. I'm not wearing a uniform, he said. Emmett's shoulders sagged with relief. I'm not taking command. Understood. I'm not taking money. I'll pretend to argue later. And Kepler comes with me. At that, Emmett looked at the German shepherd, whose amber eyes reflected the stove fire like two small lanterns. Calder Hall has never had a security consultant who expects biscuits, Emmett said, but I'll make room. For the first time that day, Harlan almost smiled. When Emmett left, the afternoon had begun to turn gold. Snow shone on the trees. The pickup rolled away, leaving fresh tracks across the drive. Harlan stood on the porch in his olive shirt and old boots, cold air moving over his clean-shaven face. Kepler stood beside him, black and gold coat bright against the white yard. One notched ear lifted toward the town. Harlan looked down at him. Just one evening, he said softly. That's all. Kepler did not wag his tail. He kept staring toward Sawyer's Reach, still as a carved guardian at the edge of a temple. As if somewhere beyond the bright roofs and smoking chimneys, fate had already started walking through the snow. By late afternoon, Sawyer's Reach had taken on the golden stillness that came before a winter evening. The snow along Main Street had been shoveled into clean white banks. Shop windows glowed amber against the cold. A wreath hung crookedly over the door of the pharmacy, and someone had tied red ribbon around the old iron lampposts, as if the whole town had decided to look brave for the season. Beyond the buildings, the Pine Hills rose dark and quiet, guarding the northern edge of Wisconsin like ancient shoulders beneath a white cloak. Harlan Briggs drove into town without hurrying. He wore the same old olive-green tactical combat shirt, softened by years of washing and weather. The cuffs frayed, the shoulder seams rubbed pale. His moss-green combat pants bore worn knees and sagging cargo pockets, practical rather than polished. His military work boots had been cleaned, but not shined. Harlan had never trusted anything that looked too new. On his wrist, the old military watch sat like a small, stubborn witness. Kepler rode in the passenger seat of the truck, sitting upright, black and gold coat catching the last light through the windshield. At 5 years old, the German Shepherd carried the strength of his prime, with the discipline of a working dog who had learned early that love and danger often entered the same room. His amber-brown eyes moved from window to window, ears high, one notched at the edge. He did not whine, he did not bark, he only watched. Calder Hall stood at the center of town, where the railroad used to cut through Sawyer's Reach. The old station had been restored with care. Red brick walls, arched windows, polished wooden doors, and a small iron sign swinging above the entrance. Tonight, warm light poured from every window. Inside, Harlan could already see figures moving past glass display cases. Dark coats, silver hair, fur collars, nervous hands holding bitter cards. It looked peaceful. That was what bothered him first. Peace, Harlan had learned, was not always the absence of danger. Sometimes it was only danger behaving politely. Emmett Calder met him near the front door, wearing a brown wool blazer, gray vest, white shirt, and a bow tie that leaned slightly to the left no matter how often he touched it. At 74, Emmett had the thin build of a man who had spent more years standing behind counters than sitting behind desks. His white hair was combed neatly, his pale blue eyes bright with welcome and shadowed by worry. "You came," Emmett said, relief escaping before manners could stop it. "I said I would. That's not always the same thing with men like you." Harlan looked at the crooked bow tie. "You dressing for an auction or a piano recital?" Emmett glanced down. "If I fall apart tonight, I prefer to do it formally." Kepler stepped beside Harlan, calm and alert. Emmett bent slightly, offering the back of his hand. Kepler sniffed once, then allowed a single slow wag of his tail. "That," Emmett said, "is the most respectful greeting I've had all day." Inside Calder Hall, warmth wrapped around them at once. The smell of polished wood, old paper, coffee, wool coats, and faint perfume filled the air. The building's high ceiling carried every sound upward until conversation seemed to float above the crowd like birds under rafters. Display cases lined the main room, each one lit from within. A captain's pocket watch, a sapphire brooch, a set of silver-handled knives, letters yellowed by war and time, a painted winter shoreline, and beneath the largest case, the North Star Atlas. The map lay flat under glass, its edges browned with age, its faded blue lines tracing old waters and forgotten routes. Harlan did not know much about antique maps, but he understood why people leaned closer to it. Some objects did not merely survive history. They accused the present of forgetting. A young man approached from the security desk near the north wall. Nolan Reeve was 27, about 5 feet 11, with a lean frame that suggested recent training but not yet hard experience. His brown hair was cut short, his face clean and earnest, with a narrow jaw and eyes that tried to appear steadier than they felt. He wore a dark event security jacket, black tactical pants, practical shoes, and a radio clipped to his shoulder. There was nothing careless about him, but there was still something untested in the way he stood, like a young tree that had never taken the full weight of an ice storm. "Mr. Briggs?" Nolan asked. "Harlan." Nolan nodded too quickly. "Yes, sir. Emmett told me you'd be observing tonight. Don't sir me unless you want me to leave." Nolan blinked, then gave a nervous half-smile. "Understood." Emmett clapped Nolan lightly on the shoulder. "Nolan's good. He worries correctly." "That's rare," Harlan said. Nolan glanced at Kepler. "Is he working?" Kepler looked up at him, as if offended by the question. "He's always working," Harlan said. "Sometimes he just lets people think he's resting." Nolan gave a quiet laugh, then walked Harlan through the security plan. Guest list at the front. 2 guards near the rear hallway, 1 guard by the loading entrance. Cameras covering the north door, main room, and storage corridor. Valuable items moving to a locked room after the auction. Emergency exits clear. Staff badges checked. Harlan listened without interrupting. He did not look impressed or unimpressed. He looked at the room. "Don't only watch the doors," Harlan said at last. Nolan straightened. "Sir?" Harlan glanced at him. "Sorry, Harlan. Watch the people who keep watching the doors." Nolan absorbs that like a lesson he had not known he needed. Before he could answer, a woman in a camel-colored wool coat crossed the room with the swift, controlled irritation of someone responsible for expensive things. Mara Voss was 46, tall and slim, with ash blonde hair cut in a sharp bob just below her jaw. Her face was elegant in a severe way, pale from office light rather than winter wind, with gray eyes that seemed trained to find cracks in contracts and fingerprints on glass. She carried a leather folder against her chest like a shield. "Emmett?" Mara said, stopping when she saw Kepler. Please tell me the dog is not staying near the displays. Kepler sat down. It was a perfect sit. Straight spine, ears up. Amber eyes calm. Mara looked at him. Kepler looked back. For one strange second, the insurance representative and the German shepherd appeared to be negotiating without language. Harlan said, "He's less likely to knock something over than most of the bidders." Emmett coughed into his hand. It sounded suspiciously like a laugh. Mara's mouth tightened, but not cruelly. "I respect trained animals, Mr. Briggs. I also respect six-figure insurance policies. One tail against the Sapphire case and my evening becomes paperwork with teeth." Kepler doesn't swing his tail indoors. As if to prove the point, Kepler gave one tiny dignified tail movement and stopped. Mara stared. Then, despite herself, she smiled just enough to lose the argument. "Fine," she said, "but if he signs a liability waiver, I want it witnessed." A small girl darted out from behind a row of chairs, carrying a stack of bitter paddles, nearly too large for her arms. Lydia Mae Turner was 12, small and quick, with honey-brown hair tied in a loose ponytail and a round face dusted with faint freckles. Her eyes were bright green and restless, the eyes of a child who heard adults whispering and understood more than they wished she did. She wore a deep red sweater beneath a puffy winter vest, jeans tucked into snow boots, and an expression of serious importance. "Grandpa Emmett," she said. "Mrs. Bell from the bakery says if anyone touches the apple tarts before intermission, she'll know." Emmett bowed solemnly. "Mrs. Bell has always had powers beyond science." Lydia noticed Kepler and froze with delight. "Is he allowed to shake hands?" Harlan opened his mouth to say no. Kepler lifted one paw. Lydia gasped as if she had been granted a royal audience. She took the paw carefully in both hands. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Dog." "His name is Kepler," Harlan said. Lydia looked up. "Like the spaceman?" "Like the astronomer," Harlan said. "Same neighborhood," Emmett added. Kepler gave another tiny tail movement. The girl laughed, and for a moment the room softened around that sound. Harlan felt it. The strange ache of watching innocence pass through a place where he had come to look for danger. Then Kepler's paw lowered. His head turned toward the rear corridor. Harlan saw it. No one else did. The dog's body remained calm, but his ears sharpened, his nose working once, twice, taking in something that did not belong to polished wood, old paper, winter coats, or warm pastry. Harlan followed Kepler's gaze. A delivery man had just passed near the side entrance carrying a plain cardboard box. He wore a dark knit cap, a gray jacket, and black gloves. Nothing obviously wrong, nothing dramatic enough to justify a hand raised, a room stopped, a night interrupted. But Lydia watched him too. Her smile faded. "That's not Mr. Calloway," she said softly. Emmett turned. "What?" "The delivery man. Mr. Calloway brings the bakery boxes when Mrs. Bell's nephew can't. He wears blue gloves. Always. Because he says black gloves make him look like a raccoon burglar." Mara blinked. "That is oddly specific." Lydia nodded with the grave certainty of childhood. "He says it every time." The deliveryman disappeared through the rear corridor. Harlan looked down at Kepler. Kepler did not growl. That would have been easier to dismiss or obey. Instead, he took one slow step toward the corridor, then stopped and looked back at Harlan. It was not fear in the dog's eyes, it was recognition. Not of the man, of the pattern. Harlan felt the air around him narrow. There are moments in life when God does not shout. He nudges, a child notices gloves, a dog stops laughing with his tail. An old soldier feels winter enter a warm room without opening a door. Harlan turned to Nolan. "Check the rear staff list again." Nolan's face changed. The nervousness did not leave, but it found a spine. "I already checked it once." "Check it like you don't want to apologize later." Nolan moved. The auction room continued filling. Wealthy collectors from the cities arrived in dark overcoats. Townspeople came in their best sweaters. A retired schoolteacher whispered to a neighbor about the North Star Atlas. Two men from Chicago argued quietly over whether the sapphire brooch had belonged to a mayor's wife or a mayor's mistress. Emmett moved among them, charming, bowing, calming, carrying the weight of the brown ledger in his chest, though the object itself remained locked away. Harlan walked the room with Kepler at his left side. He saw details, filed them, refused to exaggerate them. A rear camera flickered once, then steadied. One of the temporary servers looked lost near the coat area. A bidder from Minneapolis asked too many questions about when the high-value items would be moved. A black delivery van sat near the side of the building longer than Harlan liked, its engine running, exhaust clouding white in the cold. None of it was proof. That was the cruel thing about danger before it arrived. It dressed itself as inconvenience. Nolan returned after several minutes, his face paler. One temporary staff name doesn't match the final sheet, he said quietly. Could be a clerical error. Also, Randy near the lower storage room isn't answering radio. Who's Randy? Rear guard. 32, big guy. Talks too much when everything's fine. And now, nothing. Harlan looked across the room at Emmett, who had just taken the small podium near the front. The old man looked proud, frightened, and stubborn all at once. The crowd settled into rows. The lights warmed. Someone tested the microphone. A soft hum moved through the speakers. Mara came close, holding her folder tightly. If there is a concern, say it plainly. There's a concern, Harlan said. Is there evidence? Not enough for a courtroom. This isn't a courtroom. No, Harlan said. It's worse. It's full of people who believe nothing bad happens under good lighting. Mara did not answer. Harlan went to Emmett before the first lot was announced. He kept his voice low. Delay 10 minutes. Let Nolan verify the rear corridor and the staff list. Quietly, Emmett's smile faltered. Now, he whispered. Now, from the front row, an impatient man with silver hair and a Chicago accent called out, Mr. Calder, are we beginning tonight or admiring the lights until spring? A few people chuckled. Emmett looked at the crowd, at the cameras prepared for the live stream, at Mara, whose face showed worry now but also calculation, at Lydia near the side table, standing on tiptoe to see over grown-up shoulders, at Kepler, who had not taken his eyes off the rear corridor. The old auctioneer swallowed. Then he stepped to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, Emmett said, voice bright but thin, welcome to Calder Hall. Applause rose. Harlan did not move. Kepler did not sit. The first item was carried beneath the lights, an antique compass in a velvet-lined box. Bidding began politely. Numbers rose. Paddles lifted. The room relaxed because money, like music, could make people believe a rhythm meant safety. Harlan stood near the eastern wall, one hand resting lightly near Kepler's collar. He was no longer watching the antiques. He was watching the spaces between people, the glance that came too soon, the door that stayed open too long, the man who smiled without warmth. At the podium, Emmett lifted the auction hammer. It came down once. The sound cracked softly through Calder Hall. Kepler's ears went forward, and somewhere behind the rear corridor, a door closed with a sound too careful to be accidental. The first item sold for more than anyone expected. It was not the North Star Atlas, nor the sapphire brooch, nor anything the collectors from Chicago had come to fight over. It was a simple walnut rocking chair with a cracked armrest, said to have belonged to the first station master of Sawyer's Reach. Emmett Calder lifted his auction hammer with theatrical dignity as two elderly women in the second row bid against each other, like rival queens defending ancient kingdoms. When the price climbed past $800, Emmett looked over the room and said, if I had known old chairs were this valuable, I would have stopped standing in 1975. Laughter moved through Calder Hall. It warmed the room for a moment. People relaxed into their seats. The polished floors shone beneath amber light. Snow whispered softly against the high-arched windows. The old station looked less like a place of risk and more like a memory dressed for Sunday. Harlan Briggs did not laugh. He heard the laughter. He understood why people needed it. Fear, when unnamed, often wore the mask of good manners. But Harlan's eyes had already begun separating the room from the performance inside it. The auction was the performance. The room was the truth. A temporary server near the coat area carried a tray of coffee cups but hesitated twice at the same corner, as if he did not know the building well enough to move without thinking. A real Calder Hall staff member would have stepped around the loose floorboard near the north wall. Everyone who worked there knew it complained under weight like an old man getting out of bed. The server stepped on it once, flinched at the sound, and then stepped on it again 10 minutes later. Harlan filed that away. Near the front, a man in a black wool coat stood behind the last row of chairs. He had silver at his temples, a narrow face, and the polished stillness of a city professional. He wore leather gloves indoors, which was not enough to condemn anyone in Wisconsin during winter, but he did not look at the antiques the way bidders looked at antiques. His eyes moved from display case to rear corridor, from rear corridor to Emmett, from Emmett to the side entrance. Harlan filed that away too. Beside him, Kepler stood with quiet discipline, the 5-year-old German shepherd's golden black coat catching the low light whenever he shifted. His black saddle marked his back like a shadow laid over fire. His ears remained forward, one bearing the small notch near the edge. His amber-brown eyes followed Harlan's attention without needing a command. Kepler had been gentle with Lydia. He had tolerated Mara Voss, He had even accepted one crumb of apple tart from Emmett when Harlan pretended not to notice, but now the dog's body had settled into a different language. Not attack, not alarm, readiness. Nolan Reeve returned from the rear hallway with his radio held low in his hand. The young security guard looked less like a boy now, and more like a man discovering that responsibility had weight. His brown hair was slightly damp at the temples from the heat of the building, and his jaw was set too tightly. "Harlan," Nolan said quietly. "Randy still isn't answering. Neither is Claire from lower storage. Claire Dunn, 39, works weekend security. Red hair, short, former county dispatcher. If something's boring, she complains about it. If something's wrong, she gets very quiet." And now, Nolan swallowed. Nothing. Harlan looked toward the rear corridor. Nothing in him moved quickly. Quick was for people who had not learned the cost of panic. He let the information sit with the rest. Strange deliveryman, wrong gloves, staff mismatch, camera flicker, silent guards, unknown server, van still outside. Each piece alone was small. Together they had begun to lean in the same direction. Mara Voss came to stand beside them, her camel coat open now, leather folder pressed against her ribs. The sharpness in her face had not vanished, but something human had broken through the professional polish. Her gray eyes kept going to the display cases, then to the exits. "You both look like men pretending not to be worried," she said. Nolan looked embarrassed. Harlan did not. "Worry is useful," Harlan said. "Panic is expensive." Mara absorbed that. "Should I stop the auction?" It was the first useful question she had asked all evening. Harlan glanced at Emmett, who was coaxing another laugh from the crowd, as he introduced a set of silver-handled knives. The old auctioneer's voice was bright, but Harlan could hear the strain in it now, a thin wire pulled too tight beneath velvet. "Not loudly," Harlan said. "If we stop it wrong, we may create the thing we're trying to prevent." Mara's face paled slightly. "That is a terrible sentence. Most true sentences are." Kepler moved before anyone else did, not toward the corridor this time, toward a wooden transport crate beside the left display table. It was an ordinary crate at first glance, one of several used to move framed items and old household pieces. A paper tag hung from its handle. A folded moving blanket lay over the top. It should have smelled like dust, wood, old fabric, and the dry sweetness of stored paper. Kepler lowered his nose to one corner. Then he stepped back, not far, only half a pace. But the movement was deliberate, controlled, and deeply wrong. Harlan saw the dog's lips tighten. Not a snarl, not a show of teeth, but a small tension around the mouth. The way Kepler reacted when something familiar had been made false. The German shepherd lifted one paw and held it suspended above the floor. Lydia Mae Turner, carrying a fresh stack of bitter cards, stopped near the tea table and noticed. "Why is Kepler doing that?" she whispered. Harlan did not answer. Kepler kept his paw raised. The room seemed to grow distant around them. Voices softened. The auction hammer became a wooden heartbeat, and the winter light beyond the windows dimmed toward blue. For one strange second, Harlan felt the old world touch the new one. Not the battlefield itself, not gunfire, not smoke. Something older than memory, the instinct that lived in animals before men built doors and called themselves safe. Kepler looked from the crate to Harlan. Then, very gently, the dog placed his raised paw on the floor and pushed the crate tag sideways with his nose. A name appeared beneath the folded corner. Not a company name, not a shipping code. A handwritten word in black marker. Calder. Harlan's throat tightened. The crate had not come from outside inventory. It had been marked for Emmett personally. And Emmett did not know it was there. A single hidden name on a plain crate turns the room from suspicious into personal. Kepler has not found proof of a crime, but he has found something worse. A message placed where only someone close to the auction would know it mattered. Harlan straightened slowly. Mara had seen the word too. Her professional calm cracked just enough to show fear underneath. "That crate wasn't on my list," she said. "Don't touch it," Harlan told her. "I wasn't planning to." For once, no one argued. Harlan turned to Nolan. "Move Lydia away from the rear side of the room, quietly. Tell her she's helping Mrs. Bell with the tarts." Nolan nodded. Lydia did not want to leave. Her green eyes flashed with the stubborn bravery of children who had not yet learned that adults often lie when they say everything is fine. But Nolan bent and spoke to her gently, and at the mention of Mrs. Bell's desserts, she let herself be guided toward the refreshment table near the front, away from the corridor. Harlan shifted a cocktail table 3 inches with the side of his boot. Mara noticed. "What are you doing? Making people trip less. That is not what you're doing." "No," he said. but it's what it will look like. He moved through Calder Hall without seeming to move with purpose. He asked an elderly woman in a blue coat if the draft bothered her and suggested she sit closer to the inner wall. She thanked him and patted Kepler's head when the dog passed. He told a man with a cane that the front row had better light for seeing the map. He complimented a couple's view from the side aisle and gently redirected them away from the rear exit. Small changes, polite changes, the kind no one remembered until later, if later was merciful enough to arrive. To the room, Harlan looked like a quiet older man being helpful. Inside his mind, Calder Hall had become geometry. Chairs became cover, tables became delays, curtains became concealment, distance became time, time became breath, breath became life. He hated how naturally it returned. He hated that his body remembered before his soul had agreed. Jonah Pierce appeared in his mind without permission, not as a corpse. Never that first. Harlan remembered him laughing in a dusty hallway years ago, saying, "If I die because you overthink something, Briggs, I'm haunting you with harmonica music." Harlan almost smiled. Then the memory changed, as memories always did. Jonah's laugh vanished. A door stayed closed too long. A decision split itself into branches, and one branch led home while another led to a folded flag. Harlan pressed the memory down, not away, but lower, where it could not blind him. Kepler brushed against his leg. It was brief, a working dog's touch, no drama, no comfort anyone else would notice. But Harlan understood. Not then, here, not Jonah, these people. At the podium, Emmett lifted the North Star Atlas from its velvet case with the help of an assistant. The room murmured. Even the city collectors leaned forward. Under the lights, the map seemed almost alive, its faded blue waterways branching across yellowed paper like veins beneath old skin. "This piece," Emmett said, his voice softer now, "is not merely a map. It is a record of who found their way here before roads told us where to go." The words landed gently. Harlan looked toward the rear corridor again. The man in the black wool coat had disappeared. The temporary server was gone too. Nolan, returning from the side aisle, gave Harlan a look that said he had noticed. The microphone gave a brief crackle. Several guests glanced up, annoyed rather than frightened. A few phones on the front row showed searching signals. Mara opened her folder, then closed it again without reading anything. Emmett continued. "And before we moved to bidding, I had hoped to say something about another piece of history. Not listed tonight, but important to Sawyer's reach." Harlan's eyes sharpened. Emmett was going to mention the brown ledger now. In front of everyone, Harlan began moving before he had decided to move. Not fast, not enough to alarm the crowd. Just one step closer to the central aisle. Kepler matched him, silent at his left. Near the tea table, Lydia looked toward the side entrance. Her small face changed. Harlan followed her gaze. The deliveryman from earlier stood half-shadowed near the rear side door. He was not watching the stage. He was watching his own wristwatch. A second later, the lights flickered. Not off. Not enough for screams. Just a blink. The sort of blink him forgives because winter electricity has old habits. But Kepler did not forgive it. The German shepherd rose fully, every muscle organized beneath his golden black coat. His ears drove forward. His eyes fixed on the side entrance. A low vibration formed in his chest, so controlled it seemed less like a growl than a prayer with teeth. Harlan lowered his hand and touched two fingers lightly to Kepler's collar. Wait. Kepler wanted to move. Harlan felt it through the collar, the contained thunder of the animal beside him, but the dog obeyed. He swallowed the impulse, held the line. That was loyalty at its hardest, not charging toward danger, trusting the man he loved enough to wait beside it. Emmett, unaware of the exact shape of the danger, turned a page in his notes. "The ledger," he began, "belonged to my father." A sound came from the rear side of Calder Hall. Not loud, not dramatic, a metal latch settling into place. Then another. Harlan turned his head. The side door opened inward. The side door opened inward without a crash. That was what made it worse. Had it burst from its hinges, had glass shattered, had someone screamed from the first second, the people inside Calder Hall might have understood danger quickly. But the door opened with the calm obedience of a door being used by someone who believed he had every right to enter. 3 men stepped into the warm auction light. They wore dark winter clothing, black masks pulled low, and gloves that made their hands look empty of identity. They moved with a silence that did not belong to panic. One went toward the main aisle and stopped where he could see both rows of guests. One moved toward the small control table near the wall, where the microphone, lights, and live stream equipment had been arranged. The tallest of the three walked straight toward Emmett Calder. No one understood at first. A woman in the second row made a small irritated sound, as if the interruption were merely poor manners. A man from Chicago turned in his chair with annoyance already forming on his mouth. Then the first intruder raised his hand, and the shape of what he carried changed the meaning of the entire room. The laughter died, not gradually, not politely. It vanished. A glass slipped from someone's fingers and struck the floor. The sound was delicate, absurdly beautiful, like ice breaking on a pond. Emmett stood behind the podium with the North Star Atlas still beneath the lights. His face, usually lively with jokes and stubborn optimism, went still. Under the red warmth of the hall, he suddenly looked every one of his 74 years. Thin shoulders, white hair, pale blue eyes, caught between dignity and fear. He did not run. Auctioneers, Harlan thought, were like captains of little ships. Even when the storm came through the wall, they hated to abandon the deck. The tallest intruder reached him first. He was broad but not heavy, taller than Harlan by an inch or two, with controlled movements and a voice flattened by the mask. He gripped Emmett's upper arm and leaned close. "Storage room," he said. Now Emmett swallowed. "There are people here. That is why you'll behave." The room began to tremble in pieces. A chair scraped. Someone whimpered. One of the elderly women who had bid on the rocking chair clutched her purse as if it were a shield. Near the refreshment table, Lydia Mae Turner stood frozen, her red sweater bright against the pale tablecloth, her green eyes huge and wet but silent. Childhood had not prepared her for men who walked into warm rooms and stole the air. Harlan Briggs stood near the eastern wall with one hand resting lightly near Kepler's collar. Every part of him had gone quiet. He wore the same worn olive tactical shirt and moss green combat pants, the old clothing of a man who had tried to make usefulness look ordinary. His clean-shaven jaw had tightened, and the gray blue in his eyes seemed colder under the hall lights. He did not stare at the weapons. He had learned long ago that staring at the obvious thing could make a man miss the one that mattered. Kepler felt the shift through him. The 5-year-old German shepherd's black and gold body tightened, not from fear but from purpose. His ears drove forward. The small notch in one ear made his silhouette uneven, almost mythic beneath the amber glow. A low vibration rose in his chest, not a loud bark, not a wild threat, but a warning held under discipline. Harlan lowered 2 fingers beside his thigh. Not yet. Kepler obeyed. The obedience cost him. Harlan felt it through the leash, a contained storm wrapped in fur and loyalty. The dog wanted to place himself between the dark men and the frightened room. It was what training had taught him. It was what love demanded. But love, at its highest, was not always motion. Sometimes it was restraint. "Phones," the intruder by the aisle ordered. His voice was younger than Harlan expected. He was nervous, though he tried to cover it with volume. He had a compact build, narrow shoulders, and quick movements that jerked rather than flowed. His mask hid most of his face, but his eyes kept jumping from person to person, searching for resistance before it existed. A canvas bag appeared. Guests began dropping phones into it with shaking hands. Mara Voss stood near the display cases, pale but composed. At 46, with her ash-blonde bob and sharp gray eyes, she had built her life around risk, measured in signatures, clauses, and appraisals. Now Risk had put on a mask and entered the room with boots. Her fingers tightened around her leather folder until the edges bent. "Everyone to the center rows," the second intruder said from the control table. This one spoke less. He was medium height, wiry, and efficient. A strip of dark hair showed beneath his hat. His eyes moved over wires, switches, windows, people. Not curious, not afraid. Working. He turned off the music feed. The room became naked without it. Nolan Reeves stood half-hidden near the side passage to the old kitchen. The young guard's face had gone white, but Harlan saw the important thing. Nolan did not rush forward. He did not try to become brave in the foolish way young men sometimes do when they are terrified of appearing afraid. He remembered, keep people safe first. A cluster of guests near the rear side aisle looked ready to bolt. Nolan lifted one hand low, palm down, and guided them backward through the narrow kitchen doorway. A retired couple, a woman with a cane, and a teenage busboy slipped inside. Nolan closed the door without letting it slam. Good, Harlan thought. The first good thing in a room quickly filling with bad ones. The tall intruder pulled Emmett away from the podium. The ledger. Emmett's mouth opened, then closed. The tall man tightened his grip. "The brown ledger," he said. "Do not make me ask like a guest." A sound passed through Emmett, not speech. A little collapse of breath. Harlan saw it. So did Kepler. The dog's head turned sharply toward Emmett, then toward the tall man. Something changed in Kepler's eyes. It was not merely recognition of threat now. It was recognition of pain. Animals did not understand deeds and property records, not as people did, but they understood when an old man's fear became older than the room. Emmett lifted his chin. That book belongs to Sawyer's Reach. The tall intruder gave a small laugh. History belongs to whoever keeps it locked up. Then he said something that made Emmett's face drain of color. Come on, Emmy Cal. You hid it long enough. The nickname fell into the room like a stone dropped through ice. Emmy Cal, not Mr. Calder, not old man, not auctioneer. A childhood name, a local name. For 1 second, the entire threat changed shape. This was not only a robbery brought in from outside by strangers chasing expensive objects. Someone knew Emmett. Someone knew the old stories. Someone had carried the past into the room and covered its face with a mask. Kepler did too. The German shepherd stopped growling. That silence was worse than the growl. His amber-brown eyes fixed on the tall intruder, and his body lowered by a fraction, not preparing to leap, but preparing to disappear. Harlan touched 2 fingers to his own leg. Wait. Then he let his hand fall once toward the floor. Kepler understood the beginning of a different command. Not attack. Move unseen. But not yet. The guests were being herded toward the center of the hall. Some cried openly now. Others sat stiff as statues, hands raised, eyes refusing to look anywhere but the floor. The rich collectors and local neighbors, the polished city men and the retired school teachers, the bakery ladies and widowers and curious teenagers, all of them had become equally human under fear. That was one of fear's few honest talents. It stripped people of costume. Harlan allowed himself to be moved with them. He bent slightly, one hand on Kepler's collar, acting like a man protecting his dog rather than a man studying geometry. The aisle intruder glanced at him once, saw gray at the temples, old boots, no badge, no uniform, a dog at heel, and dismissed him. Harlan let him. He lowered himself onto one knee near the edge of the center rows, as if calming Kepler. His hand brushed the floor twice. Kepler slid down. The dog folded his body with beautiful control, chest close to the floor, paws silent against the polished wood. He did not crawl yet. He waited beneath the line of chairs, hidden by coats and the hanging edges of tablecloths. Lydia was still near the refreshment table, too far from Nolan, too visible. Harlan's chest tightened. The tall intruder dragged Emmett toward the rear storage corridor. Open it. The book is not in there, Emmett said. A mistake, maybe. Or courage. The tall man stopped. Then where? Emmett did not answer. The aisle intruder turned toward the guests. Nobody moves. His voice cracked on the last word. Harlan heard it. Fear in the wrong man could be more dangerous than cruelty. Cruelty had direction. Fear scattered. Mara, standing beside the nearest display case, saw Lydia too. Her controlled face shifted. She did not call out. Instead, she lowered her folder, letting several appraisal papers slide loose onto the floor. They scattered beneath the display table. The aisle intruder snapped his gaze toward her. Pick them up later. Mara raised both hands. They're insurance documents. If they get stepped on the valuation chain, quiet. But the distraction was enough. Lydia looked at Harlan. Harlan shook his head almost imperceptibly. Stay. Lydia's lips trembled. She was 12 years old and being asked to do the hardest thing, nothing. But she stayed. Nolan appeared again in the shadow of the kitchen doorway. His radio was useless. Harlan could see that by the frustration on his face. But the old station had been built before every cry for help depended on a signal tower. Near the kitchen door, mounted behind a small glass panel, was an old manual fire alarm pull box, left in place after renovations because Emmett liked things with history. Nolan looked at it, then at Harlan. Harlan did not nod. He only looked away. That was enough. Nolan reached up and pulled. A bell began ringing somewhere in the bones of Calder Hall. Not loud at first, then louder. Old metal striking old metal. A sound from another century, raw and stubborn, refusing to be silenced by modern failure. The intruders all reacted. Not panic, not yet. But attention shifted. The control table intruder cursed and moved toward the wall panel. The aisle intruder swung his gaze toward the kitchen. The tall man tightened his grip on Emmett and pulled him closer. Outside, beyond the brick walls and falling snow, the bell carried into the street. In the sheriff's office 2 blocks away, Dana Lockwood looked up from a stack of winter road reports. Dana, 52, had the kind of face that did not waste expression. Her dark hair, threaded with silver, was pulled back at the nape of her neck. She was not tall, but she carried herself with the compact steadiness of someone who had spent years entering rooms after other people had made terrible choices. Her winter sheriff's jacket hung over the back of her chair, and a half-finished coffee sat cold beside her radio. The station phone crackled with a broken alert from Calder Hall. Possible weapon, crowd inside. Signal dropping, then nothing. Dana stood. No drama, no speech, just motion. Calder Hall. She called to Deputy Miles, a broad young officer at the front desk. Now, back inside the auction room, Harlan heard the bell and did not look toward it. He watched the three intruders. The room had changed again. Not saved, not safe, but altered. A signal had escaped. That mattered. Kepler lay under the tablecloth near the center aisle, black and gold body nearly invisible in shadow. His eyes stayed on Harlan. No fear, no confusion, only trust. The tall intruder pulled Emmett toward the storage corridor. He did not know that an old fire bell had already called the winter outside to witness. He did not know that a young guard had chosen courage quietly. He did not know that beneath the white tablecloth, a German shepherd waited with the patience of a prayer. And he did not know that Harlan Briggs, kneeling among frightened guests like a harmless man with a dog, was counting his breathing. The bell inside Calder Hall kept ringing. It was not the clean electronic warning of a modern building. It was older than that, rougher, more stubborn, metal striking metal somewhere in the bones of the renovated station, a sound that seemed to have crawled out of another century to remind everyone that help could still be called without permission. The three masked men felt it. The guests felt it too. Hope entered the room like cold air through a cracked door, thin but real. The tallest intruder tightened his grip on Emmett Calder and dragged him closer to the storage corridor. Under the warm auction lights, Emmett's face had gone pale, but the old man had not broken. His white hair was mussed now, his bow tie hanging crooked, his wool blazer pulled sharp at one shoulder where the intruder gripped him. Yet his pale blue eyes still held something Harlan recognized from men who had survived shame long enough for courage to grow from it. "Open the storage room," the tall man said. Emmett swallowed. "The ledger isn't in there." "Then tell me where it is." "It belongs to Sawyer's Reach." The intruder leaned close. "History belongs to whoever survives the night." A woman in the front row began to cry softly. A retired teacher held her hand. Lydia Mae Turner stood frozen near the refreshment table, one hand pressed to her chest, her green eyes fixed on her grandfather. Nolan Reeve remained near the kitchen doorway, face white, body tense, the old alarm lever still pulled down behind him, and Harlan Briggs knelt among frightened guests with Kepler beside him. To the intruders, Harlan was only an older man trying to keep his dog calm. 58 years old, clean-shaven face, weathered fair skin, old olive tactical shirt, moss green combat pants, military work boots worn soft at the creases. Nothing flashy, nothing heroic. A man who looked like he had already stepped back from life. That was what Harlan let them see. Beneath his stillness, the room had become a living map. The youngest intruder stood near the center aisle, too close to the overturned cocktail table. Harlan had nudged earlier. His breathing was fast. His shoulders rose and fell too sharply. Fear lived in him like a trapped bird. The wiry intruder near the control table kept glancing between the bell panel and the windows. He was calculating time now, not people. The tallest one had Emmett. That was the only fact that mattered. Kepler lay low beneath the edge of a white tablecloth, golden black coat hidden in shadow, amber brown eyes locked on Harlan. The German shepherd's body was gathered like a bowstring, not wild, not restless, but waiting. One notched ear tilted forward. His breath was silent. Harlan lowered his hand. 2 fingers touched the floor. Wait. Kepler did not move. The old fire bell rang again and again, filling the hall with a sound that made panic want to rise. Harlan needed the opposite. Panic would send people running. Running would turn the room into a storm. He looked toward Nolan and gave the smallest shake of his head. Nolan understood. The young guard lifted both hands and whispered to the people closest to him, "Stay low. Stay still. Do not run." His voice trembled, but it did not fail. That mattered. Marava stood near the display cases, still pale, still holding the leather folder that had become useless in the face of real danger. Yet her gray eyes were clear. She had seen enough of Harlan's movements to know something was forming. Not a plan anyone had written down. Something older. Something born in the space between instinct and sacrifice. The tall intruder shoved Emmett another step toward the corridor. The captain's pocket watch sat in its velvet case on the display table behind them. During the struggle, the table had shifted, just enough to disturb the fragile mechanism inside. Its brass lid, loosened earlier for viewing, trembled open by a fraction. Then the watch chimed. One deep note. low, hollow, unexpected. It rolled through Calder Hall like a chapel bell heard across snowfields. Everyone turned toward it. For half a second, even the masked men belonged to wonder. Harlan moved, not with the speed of youth, but with the terrible economy of a man who had spent a lifetime learning which movements were necessary and which were only fear wearing shoes. He rose from one knee, not straight up but forward, low and controlled. At the same instant, Kepler came out from beneath the tablecloth. The German shepherd did not leap at a throat. He did not become the kind of violent spectacle foolish men admired. Kepler moved like a trained partner. He caught the hanging edge of the tablecloth in his teeth and pulled hard, not at a person, but at the world beneath that person's feet. The cloth snapped sideways. A line of empty glasses slid and fell. The youngest intruder jerked toward the noise, stepped back against the cocktail table. Harlan had placed in his path and lost his balance. His weapon arm swung away from the guests. Nolan crossed the distance from the kitchen doorway with a wooden chair raised not like a hero's sword, but like a barrier. He shoved the chair between the intruder and the nearest row of people, forcing space where there had been none. Harlan reached the young man before he recovered. There was no flourish, no cinematic cruelty, only a brief, controlled collision of bodies. The man's weapon knocked away across the polished floor, and Nolan dropping one knee onto the chair frame to pin it in place as a shield. The young intruder gasped, stunned more by failure than pain. "Stay down," Nolan said. His voice shook, but he said it. The wiry intruder at the control table turned too late. He saw the first man down, saw Harlan, saw Kepler, and lifted his arm in panic. Kepler placed himself between the intruder and the front row. That single movement changed the room. The German shepherd did not bark. He stood square, golden chest forward, black saddle bristling, amber eyes burning with a disciplined fury that had nothing to do with hatred. It was protection in animal form, a living wall. The intruder hesitated. A person might not have. A frightened man with a weapon might have followed fear to its worst conclusion. But something in Kepler's stillness confused him. Perhaps he expected an attack. Perhaps he expected teeth. Instead, he faced a creature who seemed to say, with every muscle, "You will not pass through me to reach them." Kepler did not save the room by violence first, but by becoming the line no one could cross. In that breath, the people saw not a dog waiting for command, but a guardian standing between fear and the innocent, as if heaven had placed 4 paws on the old station floor. Mara saw it. Lydia saw it. Emmett, even with a masked man gripping his arm, saw it too, and Harlan used the hesitation. He struck the control table with his shoulder, not the man, knocking the small equipment cart sideways. Cables loosened. A lamp swung. The intruder stumbled over the rolling base, his arm dropping long enough for Harlan to close the distance. Another short struggle. Another weapon sent skidding away, this time beneath the front row, where an elderly man instinctively kicked it farther under the chairs, and then looked shocked at his own bravery. The wiry intruder collapsed against the wall, winded and disoriented. 2 down. The tall man had seen enough. He dragged Emmett backward toward the storage corridor and pulled him close, using the old man as a shield. The room went silent again except for the fire bell and the harsh breathing of terrified people. "Don't," the tall man said. Harlan stopped. Kepler stopped too. The German shepherd stood at Harlan's left side now, head low, eyes fixed. A thin line of saliva shone on his jaw from the tablecloth, and the muscles in his shoulders moved beneath his coat. He was not tired. He was ready, but readiness was not permission. The tall man's eyes, visible through the mask, were dark and furious. "You move again," he said, "and the old man pays." Emmett's voice came thin but steady. "Harlan, quiet," the intruder snapped. Emmett ignored him. "Harlan," he said again, and somehow managed a broken smile, "if this ends poorly, tell your father I still owe him $5. The line was absurd. Beautifully, terribly absurd. A strangled laugh came from someone in the back row, then turned into a sob. Lydia covered her mouth with both hands. Even Harlan felt the words strike a place inside him that had not allowed humor in for years, because that was Emmett's courage, not strength, not youth, not power, a joke held up like a candle while darkness leaned close. The tall intruder shook him. "Where is the ledger?" Emmett's face changed. The fear remained, but something older rose beneath it. Shame, regret, duty. "I stayed quiet 40 years, he said. "Not tonight." The tall man pulled him toward the corridor. Harlan could not rush him. The angle was wrong. Too many people were behind. Too little room. A single reckless second could ruin everything. Then Lydia moved. Not toward danger, only enough. The girl reached for the metal serving tray beside the tea urn, the same tray she had been using all evening with the grave importance of a child helping grown-ups. Her hands shook so badly the cups rattled. She looked at Harlan. He gave no signal. He would never ask a child to enter the geometry of violence. But Lydia was Emmett's granddaughter, and love sometimes became brave before wisdom could stop it. She tipped the tray. It fell flat to the floor with a ringing crash. The tall intruder's eyes snapped toward the sound. One heartbeat. Harlan whispered a single word, home. Kepler knew that word. It was not a command to harm. It was not a command to chase. It meant, bring our people back. Kepler moved low and wide, not at the intruder's body, but toward the long tablecloth near his legs. His teeth caught fabric. He pulled, hard and sideways. The cloth tightened around the intruder's boot, just enough to break balance. Emmett felt the grip loosen. Harlan crossed the final distance. What happened next was brief and desperate and strangely quiet. Harlan placed himself between Emmett and the weapon, turned the danger away from the crowd, and drove the tall man backward into the edge of the storage door. The weapon fell. Kepler planted both front paws on the cloth, holding it taut until Nolan, Mara, and 2 townsmen rushed in to help keep the man down. No shot rang out. No blood spread across the polished floor. There was only the sound of the fire bell, the crying of the living, and the winter wind pressing against the windows as if the whole night had been holding its breath. The front doors burst open moments later. Sheriff Dana Lockwood entered with Deputy Miles and 2 officers behind her, moving with measured urgency, weapons lowered only when they saw the 3 intruders controlled and the guests alive. Dana's dark hair was pulled back beneath her winter sheriff's hat, her face calm in the way of people who know panic is contagious. Her eyes swept the room once, then found Harlan. He was not standing over the men. He was kneeling beside Kepler. The German shepherd stood close to him, chest rising and falling, amber eyes still searching the room as if counting every heartbeat inside it. Harlan placed one hand on the dog's neck, feeling the pulse beneath the fur. "You did it," he whispered. Kepler looked at him, not proud, not excited, just present. Lydia ran to Emmett then, and the old man folded around his granddaughter with the ledger still clutched beneath his coat. Nolan sat down hard on the floor beside the kitchen doorway, shaking so badly he had to press both hands to his knees. Mara Voss lowered herself into a chair and began laughing through tears, one short broken sound after another, as if her body had forgotten the difference between relief and grief. No one applauded. Not yet. The room was too holy for applause. People only breathed. Harlan closed his eyes for 1 second. For years, when danger ended in his memory, Jonah Pierce was always the first face waiting there. The man he could not bring home. The friend whose absence had become a room Harlan never left. But now, for the first time in years, another truth entered beside the old pain. Lydia was alive. Emmett was alive. Nolan was alive. The frightened people of Sawyer's Reach were still breathing beneath the warm lights of Calder Hall. Harlan opened his eyes and pressed his forehead gently against Kepler's. "They're still here," he said. Kepler gave one quiet breath against his cheek, and outside, beyond the old brick walls, snow continued falling on a town that had almost lost its history, but not its mourning. Calder Hall no longer looked like a jeweled music box in the snow. The warm lights were still burning, but they now fell over overturned chairs, crooked tablecloths, scattered bitter cards, broken glass, and footprints dragged through melted snow. The North Star Atlas remained under its display glass, untouched, its faded blue lines still tracing old waters across yellowed paper. The sapphire brooch still glittered in its case. The captain's pocket watch lay open in velvet, innocent after lending its one solemn note to the turning of the night. Outside, snow continued to fall as though nothing had happened. Inside, everyone knew something had. Sheriff Dana Lockwood moved through the room with the firm calm of someone who understood that order had to be rebuilt slowly. At 52, Dana carried authority without needing to raise her voice. Her dark hair, threaded with silver, was tucked beneath her winter sheriff's hat, and her square, weathered face showed very little except focus. She spoke to frightened guests gently, but when she gave instructions, people obeyed. She had the rare gift of making fear feel less ashamed of itself. Deputy Miles stood near the main door, broad-shouldered and young, with sandy hair cut short, and a face still soft enough to reveal every emotion before he could hide it. He guided guests toward the church across the street, where volunteers had begun setting out blankets and coffee. His hands shook once while holding the door open for an elderly woman, but he steadied them quickly. He was young enough to be scared and decent enough to keep helping anyway. One by one, the guests were escorted out of Calder Hall into the blue-white night. Sawyer's Reach responded the way small towns do when disaster knocks before morning. It did not wait for instructions to become kind. Across the street, the old Methodist church opened its basement hall. Pastor Ruth Kenner, a woman of 68 with warm brown skin, silver curls pinned beneath a knitted cap, and a voice that could soothe a crying child or shame a grown man into behaving, stood at the door handing out wool blankets. Beside her, Mrs. Bell from the bakery carried 2 trays of apple tarts as if pastry were a holy instrument. Mrs. Bell was short, round, red-cheeked, and famous for treating hunger like an emergency, no less serious than fire. "Sit down," she told a trembling collector from Chicago. "You can be rich after you drink something warm." The man obeyed. Back inside Calder Hall, Harlan Briggs stood near the eastern wall, one hand resting on Kepler's neck. The 5-year-old German shepherd had finally allowed himself to sit. His golden black coat was dusted with lint from the tablecloth, and one ear, the one with the small notch, tilted toward every movement in the room. Kepler's amber-brown eyes still searched faces, counting the living in his own silent way. He was not wounded, only tired from restraint and action, but Harlan checked him with the devotion of a man examining the last bridge back to his own heart. A local veterinarian arrived with a medical bag and snow on her boots. Dr. Asha Bennett was 41, tall and slender, with deep brown skin, dark eyes, and black hair braided close to her head beneath a gray wool cap. She had the practical gentleness of someone who had delivered calves at 2 in the morning and told grieving children the truth about old dogs, without making the truth cruel. She crouched in front of Kepler and let him smell her gloved hand before touching him. "Well," she said after a careful check, "your partner is bruised in pride, covered in table lint, and convinced everyone still needs supervision. Otherwise, he's sound." Harlan released a breath he had not known he was holding. Kepler leaned his shoulder against him. Mara Voss stood near the display cases with her leather folder open. Her ash-blonde bob had come loose on one side, and her camel coat bore a coffee stain she had not noticed. Earlier that evening, she had seemed built from contracts and clean lines. Now her gray eyes were red at the edges, and the papers in her hands trembled. "The atlas is here," she said softly. "The brooch, the letters, the watch, everything listed is accounted for." Emmett Calder sat on the edge of an ambulance outside the open side door, wrapped in a gray emergency blanket. His bow tie was gone, his white hair stuck up in the back. He still held the brown leather ledger beneath his coat, as if it were a sleeping child he did not trust the world to touch. Dana approached him with care. "Emmett," she said, "I need to secure the ledger." "I know," but he did not hand it over. His pale blue eyes had filled with something heavier than fear. Shame, Harlan thought. Shame had a different weight. Fear looked around for exits. Shame looked backward and found none. Emmett opened the ledger in his lap. The leather creaked. Lydia Mae Turner stood beside him, wrapped in a blanket too large for her small shoulders. Her honey-brown ponytail had loosened, and her freckled face was blotched from crying. Yet her green eyes did not leave the book. She had been brave enough for one night, but childhood had returned to her now, asking why grown-ups kept so many secrets and things with locks. Emmett turned the first page. A brittle envelope slipped out and fell onto the blanket. Kepler rose. No one commanded him. No one called him. The German shepherd stepped forward, lowered his head, and touched the envelope once with his nose. Harlan went still. On the front of the envelope, written in faded blue ink, were 3 words, "Forgive me, Ruthie." Pastor Ruth Kenner, who had just entered with another blanket, stopped in the doorway. Her face changed. The room seemed to narrow around that small envelope, around the name no one expected to hear in the aftermath of a robbery. Ruth Kenner's brown eyes, so steady moments before, filled with a grief so old it had learned to stand upright. "My mother," she whispered. "Ruthie was my mother." Emmett closed his eyes. The brown ledger was no longer just evidence, no longer just old land records, or a reason men had come masked into a warm room. It had reached across decades and touched a living woman by name. History, which people like to call the past, had suddenly lifted its head inside Calder Hall and looked at everyone still breathing. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Emmett handed the envelope to Dana with both hands. "My father wrote that," he said. He knew what happened. He wrote names down, payments, parcels, families pressured off land after bad loans and false fees. He kept it all, then locked it away like guilt could be organized into silence. Ruth Kenner held the doorframe. Lydia looked at her grandfather, as if seeing him become older in front of her. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" the girl asked. The question was small. It broke him anyway. Emmett bowed his head. "Because I was a coward longer than I was young. No one comforted him too quickly. Some truths deserved room to ache." Dana took the ledger and envelope, then looked toward Deputy Miles, evidence bag, and called Judge Whitaker. "I want this logged before sunrise." Miles nodded and hurried away. Harlan watched the scene from a few feet back. He knew evidence, he knew reports, he knew the careful handling of facts after people had nearly died. But this was different. The ledger was not only proof of wrongdoing, it was a wound with handwriting. Nolan Reeves sat on the church steps later, elbows on knees, staring at the snow between his boots. Harlan found him there. The young guard's dark security jacket was torn at one sleeve, and his face looked pale under the porch light. Nolan had done everything a frightened good man could do, but guilt had no respect for facts. "I should stopped it earlier," Nolan said. Harlan stood beside him, old boots planted in the snow. "You tried." "I wasn't sure enough." "No one is sure enough before the bad thing happens." Nolan looked up. His brown eyes were wet, though he was fighting it. "I saw pieces." "Then next time," Harlan said, "respect the pieces." Nolan swallowed. "You make it sound simple." "It isn't. Simple things don't need courage." For a while, they watched townspeople move between Calder Hall and the church carrying blankets, coffee and trembling gratitude. Harlan added, "Your job wasn't to predict the future. It was to keep people alive until the truth caught up. You did that." Nolan lowered his head. The words entered him slowly, like warmth entering cold hands. Inside the church basement, Lydia had fallen asleep against Pastor Ruth's side, still wrapped in the oversized blanket. Mrs. Bell placed a tart in front of Mara Voss and ordered her to eat it, before shock turned into foolishness. Mara obeyed with the dazed humility of someone whose whole understanding of risk had been dragged out of paper and made human. Dana found Harlan near the church doorway. "I pulled your public service record," she said. Harlan did not look at her. "Then you found almost nothing." "I found enough." He glanced over. Dana's expression remained careful, not pitying. That was good. Harlan had no patience for pity. "Navy SEAL," she said. "Protective operations. Hostage recovery. Several commendations. Then an early separation after an incident involving a man named Jonah Pierce." Kepler, lying at Harlan's feet, lifted his head at the name. Harlan's jaw tightened. Dana noticed, but she did not press. "I'm not asking about it tonight. That would be wise." "I know." The two stood in silence while snow moved under the streetlight like ash from a white fire. Dana looked toward the church basement, where survivors held paper cups of coffee with both hands and spoke in low, stunned voices. "This town owes you and Kepler," she said. Harlan's answer came at once. "I didn't do it for debt." "I know," Dana said. "That's why it matters." Near dawn, the sky turned pale over Sawyer's Reach. The kind of pale that arrives after long fear, not bright yet, but honest. Calder Hall remained taped off. Patrol lights flashed silently against the snow. The black delivery van had been taken away. The three masked men were gone in separate vehicles, their names waiting for morning paperwork and harder questions. Emmett came to Kepler before anyone left. The old auctioneer moved slowly, blankets still around his shoulders, face broken open by exhaustion and gratitude. He knelt with difficulty before the German shepherd. Kepler watched him, calm and solemn, then stepped closer. Emmett placed one wrinkled hand on the dog's golden chest. "Thank you," he whispered. Kepler licked his hand once. It was a small thing, almost nothing. But Emmett began to cry. Harlan looked away, not to avoid the feeling, but because it was too sacred to stare at directly. For years, he had lived as though one terrible moment had sentenced him to the edge of the world. Tonight, he had seen a different judgment. His past had not only carried death, it had carried skills, patience, restraint, and a dog who knew when to wait and when to rise. As morning opened slowly over the town, no one asked what the North Star Atlas was worth. No one asked how much insurance would pay. People asked, "Is Lydia all right? Where is Nolan? Did Emmett sit down? Has Kepler eaten?" And in those questions, Sawyer's Reach began to become itself again. Not untouched, not innocent, but alive. The town had not been spared fear. It had been given back the morning. A few days after the night at Calder Hall, Sawyer's Reach began pretending to be ordinary again. The bakery opened at 6. The pharmacy bell rang whenever someone stepped inside. Snowplows scraped the roads before dawn, pushing white ridges against the curbs. Men in wool caps argued gently outside the hardware store about salt, tires, and whether the winter festival should still go on. From a distance, the town looked untouched. But Harlan Briggs knew better. A place did not need broken windows to be changed. Sometimes a town changed in the way people looked at doors, in the way they counted children before leaving a room, in the way laughter returned, a little softer at first, as if asking permission. Calder Hall remained closed for repairs. A handwritten sign hung on the front door in Emmett Calder's shaky script. The auction will resume when the hammer stops trembling. People stopped to read it and smiled, because Emmett's humor had survived. That mattered to them. It meant the old auctioneer had not let fear steal his final word. Stories of the night spread through Sawyer's Reach with the usual small-town disrespect for accuracy. By Tuesday morning, Kepler had supposedly leapt over 6 tables, disarmed a criminal by staring at him, and saved a tray of apple tarts from certain doom. By Wednesday, Harlan had become 10 years younger in the telling and had moved faster than lightning, according to a man who had spent the entire incident under a chair. Harlan heard one version at Bell's Bakery while buying coffee. Mrs. Bell, round-cheeked and red-faced from the ovens, told a customer, "That dog came out like a golden wolf sent by heaven." Kepler sat beside Harlan's boot, black and gold coat clean again, amber brown eyes half closed in patient dignity. The 5-year-old German shepherd looked less like a heavenly wolf and more like a professional negotiator hoping for a biscuit. Harlan looked down at him. "Don't let it go to your head," he said. "You're already difficult." Kepler's ears lifted. Mrs. Bell slid a biscuit across the counter. "Heroes get difficult. It's in the contract." Harlan almost smiled, almost. Yet when he returned to his cabin at the edge of town, the silence waiting there was different from before. It was not empty exactly. It was listening. The small cedar cabin still smelled of stove smoke, coffee, leather, and pine. Harlan's old military watch still ticked on his wrist. His olive green tactical combat shirt still bore frayed cuffs and faded seams. His moss green combat pants still had worn knees and sagging cargo pockets. Nothing visible had changed, but Harlan had. Before Calder Hall, he had looked at Sawyer's Reach from the outside, as though the town were a painting behind glass. Beautiful, fragile, and not his to touch. Now he saw the gaps. The school gym had no clear winter evacuation plan for elderly visitors during public events. The medical clinic kept one generator, but not enough trained volunteers to manage a long outage. The upcoming ice festival would bring hundreds of people into the square, including children, tourists, and old neighbors who moved slowly on slick streets. Harlan did not want to see these things, but seeing had never asked his permission. On Friday morning, Sheriff Dana Lockwood came to the cabin. The day was bright and cold, the sky a hard blue above the pines. Dana arrived in her sheriff's truck without sirens, without ceremony. At 52, she carried herself with the steady economy of a woman who had learned that authority was quieter when it was real. Her dark hair, streaked with silver, was pulled back beneath a knit cap. Her winter sheriff's jacket was zipped to the collar, and snow dusted her boots. Her face was calm but not soft. Dana Lockwood did not come to flatter people. She came when something needed doing. Harlan opened the door before she knocked. "You here to arrest the dog?" he asked. Dana glanced down at Kepler, who stood beside Harlan with formal politeness. "Depends," she said. "Has he accepted illegal biscuits?" Kepler looked toward the kitchen counter. Harlan sighed. "He refuses to answer without counsel." Dana's mouth twitched. "Smart dog." Inside, Harlan poured coffee. Dana accepted it black. Kepler settled near the stove, not sleeping, not fully resting, but listening the way working dogs listened, with his whole body. Dana did not place the folder on the table right away. She looked around the cabin. The plain walls, the locked rifle cabinet, the old boots by the door, the absence of displayed medals. It was the home of a man who had kept proof of his life out of sight. Finally, she sat. "I'm not here to make you a deputy," she said. "Good. I'm not here to ask you to carry a badge. Better. And I'm not here to ask you to go back to war." Harlan looked at her then. Dana set the folder on the table. "I'm here because Sawyer's Reach needs to learn how not to freeze when a plan breaks." Harlan said nothing. She opened the folder. Inside were sketches, notes, maps of the school, church, town square, clinic, Calder Hall, and the winter festival grounds. "I want to create a community safety unit," Dana said. "Volunteers, event staff, teachers, shop owners, security people like Nolan, people who don't need to become fighters, but do need to know how to move the elderly out of a room, how to keep children calm, how to notice what doesn't belong, how to communicate when systems fail." Harlan's jaw tightened. "I don't teach combat. I don't want combat. You want what comes before it." "I want what prevents it," Dana said. That landed closer than Harlan expected. For a moment, the room was quiet except for the stove and Kepler's slow breathing. Then Kepler stood, not suddenly, not dramatically. He rose with calm purpose, walked to the window, and stared toward the road into town. His ears lifted, one edge marked by that old notch. The sunlight caught the gold in his coat until he looked almost carved from winter fire. Harlan followed his gaze. Outside, a small line of children walked along the road with a teacher, bundled in bright coats, heading toward the church basement for a safety assembly. One little boy slipped on the packed snow. Before the teacher could reach him, two other children pulled him up, brushed off his sleeves, and made him laugh. Kepler watched until they disappeared behind the pines. Then the dog turned and looked at Harlan. There was no command in his eyes. No demand. Only that old, impossible understanding animals sometimes carried, as if love could see the road ahead before pride was willing to step onto it. Harlan had spent years believing Kepler guarded him from the world, but in that quiet moment he understood the truth. Kepler had been waiting for the world to become safe enough for Harlan to return to it. Dana did not interrupt. Harlan sat back down slowly. People will expect things from me, he said. Yes, I might disappoint them. Yes, I might be wrong. Dana's voice softened but did not become sentimental. You might, so might I, so might every person who ever steps into responsibility instead of away from it. Harlan looked at the folder. I had a teammate, he said. Dana waited. Jonah Pierce. He trusted me. Harlan's clean-shaven face remained controlled, but his gray-blue eyes had gone somewhere far from the cabin. There was a door, a timing call. I made the call that saved the most people. He was not one of them. The words entered the room without drama. They did not need any. Some grief was too old to raise its voice. Dana looked down at her coffee, giving him the mercy of not being watched too closely. At Calder Hall, she said. You made calls too. That time everyone lived. That matters. It doesn't erase Jonah. No, Dana said. But maybe Jonah doesn't need erasing. Maybe he needs you to stop treating his memory like a locked room. Harlan looked at her sharply. Dana held his gaze. She had not said it cruelly. That made it harder to dismiss. Kepler came to Harlan then and placed his head on the man's knee. The German shepherd did it gently, with the same quiet loyalty he had offered every morning, every night, every year. Harlan had tried to disappear without leaving town. Kepler did not understand every word, but he understood weight. He understood when his person was carrying too much alone. Harlan placed one hand on Kepler's head. The dog's fur was warm under his palm. What exactly are you asking? Harlan said. Dana slid one page from the folder. Start small. 3 evenings. Teach Nolan and a dozen volunteers how to read a room, protect exits, guide civilians, and stay calm. No weapons training, no hero speeches, no nonsense. That last one rules out half the town. Dana smiled. Mrs. Bell has already demanded final approval over the coffee. Then it's doomed, probably. The humor came easier this time. Harlan looked at Kepler. You hear this? They want us to attend meetings. Kepler blinked. That's worse than gunfire, Harlan said. Dana laughed once, low and surprised. Then Harlan's face sobered. If I do this, he said, Kepler comes with me. Dana nodded as if she had expected nothing else. Not as a mascot, Harlan continued. Not for photographs. Not so people can clap at him. I understand. He is my partner. Dana looked at Kepler, then back at Harlan. Then Sawyer's Reach just hired 2 consultants. 3 weeks later, Calder Hall reopened, not for an auction, but for a gathering. The repaired hall still carried faint scars if one knew where to look. A polished patch on the floor, a replaced pane of glass, a new lock on the storage corridor. But the lights were warm again, and this time the room held no bidding paddles. It held folding chairs, coffee urns, winter coats, and people who had come not to buy history, but to face it. Emmett Calder stood at the podium, with the brown ledger resting before him. He looked thinner than before, but clearer. His white hair was combed, his blazer neat, and his bow tie once again leaning left. Pastor Ruth Kenner sat in the front row, silver curls bright beneath the lights, hands folded around the old envelope addressed to her mother. Lydia sat beside her grandfather's chair, proud and solemn, guarding the chipped auction hammer Emmett had given her as an award for bravery and inappropriate use of tea service. Emmett's voice trembled when he spoke, but it did not fail. This book should have been opened long ago, he said. Some of us inherit land, some inherit money, some inherit silence. Tonight I am done inheriting silence. No one cheered. They listened. That was better. The ledger would go to the county museum and the court. The truth inside it would not mend every wound quickly. Land lost decades ago could not simply be handed back with an apology and a casserole, but names would be read, records would be examined. Families who had carried old confusion would finally know they had not imagined the injustice. Nolan Reeve was the first to sign up for Harlan's Community Safety Unit. He arrived with a notebook, a nervous expression, and a determination that made him stand taller. Mara Voss offered funding for new emergency lighting and clearer evacuation routes, though she insisted, with dry dignity, that any German Shepherd involvement must be listed as operational support, not entertainment. Mrs. Bell volunteered refreshments and threatened to withdraw them if anyone used the word committee too often. Harlan stood near the back with Kepler at his side. He still did not like crowds. He still did not like praise. When someone called him a hero, he looked faintly uncomfortable, as if accused of theft, but he did not leave. After the gathering, he and Kepler walked through the town square beneath a clean winter sun. Children waved. Nolan lifted a hand from across the street. Emmett, standing outside Calder Hall, raised the chipped auction hammer like a ridiculous royal scepter. Even Dana, beside her sheriff's truck, allowed herself a smile. Harlan wore the same olive tactical shirt, the same moss green pants, the same old boots. Kepler walked beside him, black and gold coat shining, head high, neither pet nor symbol, but companion. At the edge of the square, Harlan paused. For years, he had lived beside Sawyer's Reach without belonging to it. Now the town moved around him not as a painting behind glass, but as a living thing that knew his name and had made space for him. Kepler pressed his shoulder lightly against Harlan's leg. Harlan looked down. "All right," he said softly. "We'll stay." Kepler gave one quiet wag of his tail, and beneath the bright northern sky, the soldier who had spent years standing at the edge of white snow finally stepped back into the warmth of the people he had saved. Sometimes God does not send a miracle with thunder in the sky or a voice from the clouds. Sometimes he sends it through a quiet man who has been broken but not defeated. Sometimes he sends it through a loyal dog who senses danger before people can explain it. And sometimes he sends it through one small act of courage at the exact moment fear tries to take over the room. Harlan Briggs spent years believing that his past had only left him with pain. He thought the mistakes, the losses, and the memories of those he could not save had made him unworthy of standing beside others again. But that night at Calder Hall, he learned something many of us forget in our own lives. The wounds we carry are not always meant to destroy us. Sometimes, with God's grace, those wounds become wisdom. Sometimes, the very pain we tried to hide becomes the reason we are able to help someone else survive. Kepler, his faithful German shepherd, reminds us that love does not always need words. True loyalty watches, waits, protects, and stays. In a world full of noise, Kepler listened to what others missed. In a room full of fear, he stood where he was needed. That is the kind of love God often places in our lives. Quiet, steady, and strong enough to pull us back toward hope. This story teaches us that courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is choosing to do what is right while fear is still standing beside us. It also reminds us that no person is too broken to be used for good. No life is too quiet to matter, and no act of kindness is too small for God to turn into something greater. In our everyday lives, we may not face a room full of danger, but we all face moments when someone needs us to notice, to listen, to forgive, to speak up, or to step forward. Maybe the miracle we are waiting for is not only something God will send to us. Maybe one day, God will use us to become that miracle for someone else. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what lesson you took from Harlan and Kepler's journey. And if you believe in stories of loyalty, faith, courage, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel and join us for more. May God bless you, protect your family, guide your steps, and remind you that even in the coldest seasons of life, His light can still find its way through the snow.